The Zalvani Dominion had conquered over 100 worlds, shattered empires, and subjugated species before they even reached their first millennium as a starfaring race. They had seen countless civilizations crawl from their cradles, stretch their hands toward the stars, and then burn under the Dominion's rule. So when the reports arrived, primitive vessels of an unregistered species sighted near the edge of the Dominion's territory, their response was not concern but amusement. Supreme Warlord Valak stood at the center of the command deck, his scaled fingers drumming lazily against the curved metal railing. The holographic display before him flickered, bringing up images of the so-called Terran fleet. Dozens of ships, none larger than a Dominion escort frigate, drifted in the void like debris waiting to be swept aside. Some bore crude ballistic weapons, others energies shielding that barely registered against the Dominion's planetary assault capabilities. They were nothing. His war council watched the display with visible disdain. General Carvelos, the fleet's second-in-command, let out a deep, guttural laugh. Is this their defense? Tell me, Warlord, are we certain these creatures even have a military? Perhaps they're merely lost merchants. Laughter rumbled through the chamber. Valak did not join them. He had crushed too many civilizations to waste breath on mockery. Instead, he turned to the nearest communications officer. Have they responded to our ultimatum? They insist on negotiations, the officer said, mandibles clicking in distaste. They do not acknowledge our demand for surrender. They claim their forces are prepared for any hostile engagement. Valak's eyes narrowed. It was always the same. The young races never knew their place until the fire rained down upon their cities. He gestured toward the screen where the pitiful human fleet floated in silence. Open a channel, he said. A moment later, the image of a human appeared on the display. A male, dressed in stiff military garb, his expression carefully neutral. His eyes, however, held a defiance Valak had seen before, one that usually shattered when the first cities fell. I am Admiral James Halstead of the United Terran Defense Force, the human said. His voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it, something that was not fear. You are in violation of Sol's sovereign space. Withdraw your fleet immediately. Valak allowed himself the smallest smile. This was the part he enjoyed. Admiral, he said smoothly, do you understand the nature of the force before you? He motioned to the display, where his fleet of world killers loomed beyond the human vessels, their weapons primed. Your species has barely crawled from its homeworld, yet you speak to us as if we are equals. That is an insult I will allow only once. I speak as a representative of a sovereign world, Halstead replied. Your fleet has entered our system without authorization. Your demands are unacceptable. You will leave, or we will consider this an act of war. Carvelos let out another barking laugh. War? With what? Those floating scrap heaps? We could reduce your entire species to dust within an orbital cycle. Halstead did not so much as blink. Many have tried. There was silence on the Dominion side. For a moment, just a moment, something unreadable passed across Valak's expression. Then it was gone, replaced by cold amusement. Then let this be a lesson, Valak said, leaning forward, his voice low and sharp. The Dominion does not negotiate with the weak. We do not bargain. We do not acknowledge your sovereignty. We recognize only one law, supremacy. Halstead remained motionless. If the weight of those words affected him, he showed no sign of it. So be it, he said. The transmission cut out. The War Council erupted in laughter again, a deep, chittering chorus of amusement at the bravado of these doomed creatures. Carvelos shook his head, baring his fangs. Foolish! What a waste of words! What a waste of time! Send in the forward fleet, Valak ordered, his voice bored. Destroy their vessels. Cripple their stations. Let them watch before we burn their world. The Dominion's fleet surged forward, their weapons humming with energy. On the bridge of the flagship, the commanders watched the human ships drift in silence, seemingly paralyzed by the inevitability of their destruction. The war had begun, Or so the Zalvani believed. The Zalvani fleet advanced in perfect formation, a wall of warships gliding toward their prey with the inevitability of a crushing tide. Their battle cruisers, each one the size of a Terran city, cast long shadows across the void, their hulls bristling with weapon arrays that had reduced entire civilizations to ash. The humans had made no attempt to retreat. Their ships still hung in place, engines running cold, as if frozen in fear. It was almost disappointing. Aboard the Dominion flagship, Supreme Warlord Valak watched with measured disinterest. A part of him had hoped these humans would at least attempt resistance, if only to provide a brief flicker of amusement before the slaughter. Yet they remained still, like prey too stunned to run. He turned toward his second-in-command. "Begin the attack," he ordered. General Carvelos bared his fangs in anticipation and gestured to the fleet commanders. Energy signatures flared across the Zalvani vessels as weapons powered up. Plasma cannons locked onto targets. Torpedoes loaded. Targeting systems mapped out firing solutions. The Dominion's battle doctrine was simple: overwhelm, obliterate, move on. And yet, something felt off. Valak narrowed his eyes at the display. The human fleet remained inert, not even attempting to maneuver. He had seen doomed species try many things: fleeing, scrambling for last-ditch diplomacy, even suicidally charging into battle. But this stillness, this absolute calm, was new. Then, for the first time in his long and storied career, Valak felt a sliver of unease. What are they waiting for? Admiral James Halstead sat in his command chair aboard the UTDF Retribution, his expression impassive as the Zalvani fleet closed in. Around him, the bridge was silent, every officer at their station, every screen pulsing with incoming tactical data. The Dominion's weapons were fully powered now, moments from firing. "Sir," Commander Elena Park said from the operations console, her voice tight, "enemy fleet is at optimal range. They're preparing to fire." Halstead gave a slow nod. "Good. Confirm battle stations. All platforms standing by." Park replied, "Orbital grid at full readiness." He glanced at the tactical display. The enemy formation was flawless, just as expected. The Zalvani always moved like a blade through soft flesh, cutting straight for the heart. It was the same arrogance that had made them unstoppable for centuries. And today, it would be their downfall. "Fleet remains on standby," said Captain Rhodes, his voice carrying just a trace of doubt. "Are we really not engaging, sir?" Halstead met his gaze. "They think we're fighting this battle in space." He turned back to the display, watching the Dominion fleet drift deeper into Sol's gravity well. They couldn't be more wrong. The Dominion ships had committed fully, pushing past Earth's outer orbital perimeter, advancing in a slow but steady wall of destruction. "Just as planned. Enemy fleet has locked weapons," Park reported. "First wave of plasma lances incoming." Halstead exhaled slowly. It was time. "All units, execute Protocol Thunderstrike." The moment his words left his lips, the void changed. A split second before the first Zalvani plasma lances could fire, space itself lit up with violence. From the darkened side of the moon, from the orbital rings disguised as dead satellites, from defense stations hidden in the radiation belts, the cannons roared. Titanic railguns, some nearly a kilometer long, discharged hypervelocity slugs at a fraction of light speed, each round carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through a warship's shields and keep going. Plasma turrets flared to life, sending concentrated beams into the enemy formation with surgical precision. And then came the pulse weapons, experimental energy disruptors that shattered shield harmonics before the Dominion commanders even realized they were under attack. The Zalvani fleet reeled as entire battleships vanished in an instant, their hulls collapsing inward before bursting apart in eerie silence. The first volley alone crippled the Vanguard, shattering the elegant wall of destruction into a chaotic field of burning wreckage. Valak shot to his feet, his eyes flaring wide. What is happening?" Carvelos stammered. The command deck was in chaos now, officers scrambling over displays, shouting into communication relays. The Dominion fleet was under attack. No, it had been ambushed. Valak's mind raced. The human ships had done nothing. They were still just sitting there. And yet, their fleet was being annihilated. Then it hit him. The fleet was never the threat. His gaze snapped to the system map. The planet, the orbital space, the dead satellites. It was all a trap. His fists clenched, claws digging into his palms. They were never fighting in space, he growled. They were fighting from orbit. Aboard the Retribution, Halstead watched as another Zalvani dreadnought split apart, its reactor going critical in a blinding explosion. The tactical display showed the Dominion fleet fracturing, their cohesion broken, their precision crumbling into disarray. "They're confused," Captain Rhodes said, almost in disbelief. "They don't know where to focus their counterattack." "Of course they don't," Halstead said calmly. "They've never fought an enemy who doesn't play by their rules." And the rules had changed. Earth had never intended to match the Dominion ship for ship. That was suicide. Instead, they had built something far more dangerous, an orbital kill zone, a network of railguns, laser platforms, and magnetic accelerator cannons hidden in plain sight. The Zalvani had thought they were striking at a weak fleet. Instead, they had flown straight into the jaws of a waiting predator. "Enemy losses increasing," Park reported. "Their formation is breaking." Halstead allowed himself a small nod. The battle was far from over, but the first move had been played, and it had not been the Zalvani who dictated it. "Keep firing," he ordered. "Let's see how long their arrogance lasts." The void was alive with fire and ruin. Zalvani warships twisted in desperation, their gleaming hulls torn open by unseen weapons that struck from impossible angles. What had begun as a triumphant advance had turned into a killing field. The Dominion fleet had been trained for planetary bombardments, for decisive strikes that shattered enemy worlds in a matter of hours. They had never been forced to fight upward, to defend themselves against a threat embedded into the very fabric of space. Inside the UTDF Retribution, Admiral Halstead watched as the Zalvani struggled to adapt. They were powerful, yes, overwhelming in force and sheer size, but they were not invincible. Not here, not in Earth's orbit, where every trajectory had been calculated, every potential engagement mapped out years in advance. A crimson icon blinked on the tactical display, an enemy battleship, wounded but still functional, turning its heavy plasma cannons toward the surface below. "They're trying to bypass the orbital grid," Commander Park snapped. "Targeting Earth directly." Halstead didn't hesitate. "Redirect Grid 5's firepower. Prioritize planetary defense." In the space of a heartbeat, a cluster of hidden platforms adjusted their targeting. The battleship never got the chance to fire. A railgun round, accelerated to near-relativistic speeds, punched through its central structure. For a brief moment, it held together, a flickering hulk of wounded metal. Then its core detonated, sending a chain reaction through the remaining power cells. The explosion bloomed outward, shredding two nearby escorts in a flash of white-hot plasma. Across the command deck, officers exchanged glances. The Zalvani had never needed shields against planetary targets before. They had never expected resistance from the ground up. "They're trying to regroup," Captain Rhodes said, voice taut. "Their flagship is pulling back." Halstead followed his gaze to the tactical screen. The Zalvani command vessel, the Vorkarun, was pivoting away from the heart of the battle, its escort ships clustering around it like nervous sentries. Valak was retreating to assess the battlefield, regaining composure after the shocking losses. Smart, but too late. "Fire control, lock the Vorkarun," Halstead said. "All long-range platforms. Engage." On the far side of the moon, an array of heavy cannons adjusted their positioning. These were the largest weapons in the orbital network. Planetary defense railguns originally designed to repel extinction-level asteroid impacts. Now, they had a new purpose. Targets locked, came the confirmation. Fire, the weapons discharged in perfect synchronization. The slugs crossed the distance in moments, each one carrying enough kinetic force to vaporize entire city blocks. The Vorkarun's shields flared under the impact, struggling to compensate, but the barrage was relentless. One slug broke through, striking along the ship's midsection, ripping through armor plating like paper. Another slammed into its leftmost engine cluster, sending it into a violent spin. Inside the flagship's command center, Supreme Warlord Valak barely kept his footing as the deck lurched beneath him. Warning sirens blared across every console. His crew was shouting, scrambling to adjust power flow, but the damage was catastrophic. Shields failing, a weapons officer barked. Hull breaches across multiple sectors. Valak's claws dug into the metal railing as he bared his fangs. This was impossible. How are they doing this? Carvelos demanded, his own voice edged with something Valak had never heard from him before: fear. The warlord's mind raced. The humans hadn't just hidden these defenses. They had engineered this moment, luring the Dominion into a controlled battlefield. Their fleet had been a decoy. Their silence had not been fear, but strategy, and they had underestimated them. For the first time, the realization of it settled into his bones. This wasn't a species flailing in its death throes. This wasn't a civilization scrambling for survival. This was a predator defending its den. Valak turned sharply. Order all ships to recalibrate targeting. Locate their orbital stations and destroy them, now. A chorus of acknowledgments filled the bridge, but he could already see the flaw in his command. The fleet was scattered. They had been forced into defensive positions, unable to consolidate their firepower. His forces were still mighty, but they had lost their most valuable advantage: momentum. A deep vibration ran through the ship as another railgun round struck. Systems flickered, and for the first time in his long, decorated career, Valak tasted the bitter tang of uncertainty. Aboard the Retribution, Halstead leaned forward slightly, watching as the Zalvani command vessel wavered under the continued bombardment. This was a turning point. "They won't last much longer," Park murmured. "No," Halstead agreed. "They won't." The Dominion had begun this battle, believing they would teach humanity a lesson. Instead, they had walked straight into a war they didn't understand, and they were losing. The Zalvani had always believed in the simplicity of conquest. Strength dictated the fate of civilizations, and theirs was a strength that had shattered empires. But now, as their fleet fractured under relentless fire, Supreme Warlord Valak understood that brute force was not enough. His command ship, the Vorkarun, listed heavily as another railgun round punched through its lower decks, igniting secondary explosions along the hull. Damage reports scrolled across the tactical displays in chaotic streams of red text. The fleet was in disarray, their once impenetrable formations broken apart like brittle glass. The humans had turned their own momentum against them, trapping them in a web of coordinated orbital fire. And they had not yet stopped firing. Valak gritted his teeth as the deck trembled beneath him. Status of the fleet? Carvelos, his usual bravado gone, hesitated before answering. 17 capital ships destroyed, 47 heavy cruisers down, dozens of escorts lost. Our forces are attempting to regroup, but his voice trailed off as another Dominion dreadnought erupted in a silent inferno on the view screen. The humans weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting to win. Valak exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Every battle he had fought had followed the same script. The enemy collapsed under the weight of Dominion firepower. But these humans had rewritten the rules. They had drawn the Zalvani in, let them believe victory was inevitable, then sprung a trap so devastating it had torn the heart from the invasion force before the real battle had even begun. And the worst part, it was working. Aboard the UTDF Retribution, Admiral Halstead remained focused, watching as the once mighty Dominion fleet reeled. "Enemy command vessel remains operational," Park reported. "They're trying to regroup their forces." Halstead studied the tactical display. The Zalvani were still dangerous. Despite their losses, they outnumbered the Terran fleet. But numbers no longer dictated this battle. They were scattered, their cohesion shattered. They were reacting, not dictating the fight. "Now we push," Halstead said. "Signal all fleet units. Press the attack." Across the battlefield, the human fleet surged forward. They had been waiting for this moment. For the first time, they were no longer a wall of silent sentinels. Now, they became hunters. Railguns thundered as Earth's defense grid unleashed another coordinated volley. Zalvani cruisers, already struggling to maintain formation, fell one after another. Torpedo salvos streaked through the void, weaving between wreckage before detonating inside vulnerable engine housings. The Dominion's remaining battleships fired wildly, but their shots lacked coordination, and then the Retribution led the charge. Halstead's ship speared through the remnants of the Zalvani line, flanked by a dozen Terran warships. Pulse cannons raked across enemy hulls, slicing through weakened armor. Fighters darted through the chaos, striking at exposed power relays and vulnerable weapon emplacements. The Zalvani had come to crush a defenseless world. Instead, they had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and outmatched. Aboard the Vorkarun, Valak saw the inevitable unfold. He had led invasions against 100 worlds, but he had never seen a species fight like this. Not just with desperation, but with precision, with planning, with an unwavering refusal to kneel. "This battle is lost," Carvello said quietly. Valak did not respond. He already knew. Across the Dominion fleet, survival instincts took hold. Ships disengaged, breaking away from the fight, retreating into the void. The retreat was uncoordinated, messy. Some vessels refused to abandon their commanders and perish for it. Others fled without orders, vanishing into the dark. The Dominion fleet was in full collapse. Aboard the Retribution, Halstead gave the final order. "All units, drive them out." The battle for Earth was over. Humanity had not just survived. They had won. The silence after battle was always the strangest part. The wreckage of the Dominion fleet drifted in Sol's orbit. The once mighty warships, now nothing more than shattered hulks. Some still burned, their ruptured cores venting plasma into the void. Others floated lifelessly, gutted by railgun fire, their crews lost to the vacuum. The few Zalvani vessels that had escaped were long gone, vanishing into the depths of space with their tails between their legs. Admiral Halstead stood on the Retribution's bridge, watching the aftermath unfold across the tactical display. The once perfect formations of the Dominion fleet were gone, replaced by the scattered remains of what had been their greatest invasion force. The war was not over, not yet, but today, Earth had sent an unmistakable message. "We're receiving transmissions from the surviving Zalvani ships," Commander Park reported. "Most are distress calls. Some surrender requests." Halstead's jaw tightened. The Zalvani had never surrendered before. They had never needed to, until now. "Tell them to hold position," he said. "We'll decide their fate soon enough." A few hours ago, the thought of a Dominion fleet begging for mercy would have been unthinkable. Now, it was reality. The balance of power had shifted, and not just in Sol. Across the bridge, Captain Rhodes studied the wreckage with wary eyes. "They'll be back," he muttered. "They won't let this stand." Halstead nodded. The Dominion had ruled through sheer, unquestioned dominance for centuries. A single defeat, even one this catastrophic, would not be enough to break them, but it would change them. "Maybe," he said, "but they won't come back the same, because this battle hadn't just been about Earth's survival. It had been about something bigger. The myth of the Dominion's invincibility had been shattered. Across the galaxy, countless worlds lived under the shadow of Zalvani rule, believing resistance was impossible. But now, they would see what humanity had done, and they would begin to wonder. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. "Incoming transmission," Park announced. "Encrypted. Not Zalvani." Halstead frowned. "Source?" "Unknown," she said. "But it's coming from deep space. somewhere beyond Dominion territory. The bridge fell silent. Then the transmission flickered onto the main screen. A figure appeared, alien but not Zalvani. Their features were sharp, their eyes filled with something Halstead recognized instantly. Hope! A single sentence came through the static, spoken in a language that had, until now, never reached human ears. We saw what you did. A pause. We are ready to fight. Halstead exhaled slowly. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning.